Let's talk about Plato's Meno. So the Meno is the dialogue that I like to start people off in with intro to philosophy classes. And the reason for this is because it's kind of a starter dialogue. It's not that the topic is particularly easy per se. I mean, he's talking about virtue, arete. Excellence in ancient Greece, virtue, was not something that is like the way that we use the word today, only in part. And so we'll have to talk about that. So that's not what makes it easier. What makes it easier is that the structure of the dialogue is very characteristic for Socratic dialectic. So Socrates adopts the typical sort of progression. It's instructive in a variety of ways. Meno even comments on it, how it is that that sort of thing happens and how it is that they're going through the different phases and whether it's a good thing or not and how it's supposed to work. And ultimately, that's part of what it is that they're addressing in the dialogue is not just virtue. They're not just talking about the nature of virtue. Arguably, the central question for the Meno is whether or not virtue is teachable. And so they're talking about teaching virtue. That's decidedly different. It's a decidedly different sort of question. And how do you teach something? Well, for Socrates, it's dialectic. And so, quite naturally then, when we're introducing people to Socratic dialectic for the first time, it helps for them to be conspicuously conscious of how it is that that dynamic works. So, I think that's really helpful when it comes to encountering the Meno for the first time, when it comes to encounter Socrates and Plato for the first time through the lens of the Meno. Okay, so let's get started with the dialogue. So what happens first? So Socrates says, okay, we're looking for virtue. Tell me about virtue. And Meno responds by giving him a list of virtues. And this is not just your average person sort of, on the street kind of thing. Remember, Socrates likes to choose exemplars. So these are people who presumably, if anyone knows about these topics, it's going to be them. And now, who then would be the best in terms of being a teacher of virtue? Well, for the ancient Greeks, the people who purported to be able to teach virtue were the sophists. And so Meno is presumably a sophist, the way that he refers to giving speeches on virtue, and he's associated with Gorgias, and Gorgias is definitely a sophist. There's an additional dialogue by that same name written about him. And so he's talking to a sophist who purports to be able to teach people about virtue. Now, he starts by giving a bunch of examples. Socrates immediately backs off and says, oh, no, you're embarrassing me with a wealth of examples. But, it's just a nice way of saying you got it wrong. And one that is in concert with, in keeping with Socrates' overall push to maintain the motivation of his interlocutors at all times. So he will start the conversations frequently by saying, oh, well, I hear that you're the expert with this. And so you need to tell me then because I don't know. And so the people are typically more than willing to say, oh, sure, I'll explain this to you. I'm very comfortable with doing this. I do it all the time. And so that's the kind of situation that Socrates is working with. He gets people to establish their own momentum by asking these sorts of questions and putting himself ironically and ostensibly beneath them. But then he continues to ask questions. It's like, oh no, not examples of things. I'm not looking for examples of individual virtues. I'm looking for the unifying characteristic. What is the essence of virtue itself? What is the thing that all of the virtues have in common? And this is not normally the way that we enter into one of these discussions. When we ask somebody, what is a car, oftentimes they'll tell us what a car is by giving us individual examples of it. Now, insofar as we are more philosophically inclined or we recognize the abstractness of the question, then we might be inclined to actually say, okay, well, it's this thing that has wheels and a steering wheel, but then we ask more questions. It's like, well, does it actually need all of those things? What if they're in disrepair? What if one of them is broken? What if one of them is missing? Is it still a car if it doesn't have the steering wheel attached, but it's like laying over on the side? I think we're inclined to say, yeah, it probably is. That's not really what's going on here. And one of the things that I think is useful for us to keep in mind at this stage is what's happening with language. So oftentimes with language, especially in English, and this is something that anthropologists did not fail to notice as people started doing comparative linguistics and comparative cultural studies, is that now we tend to move the subject away from the verb, such that in modern German, French, English, Italian, the subject is separated from the verb. So I would say, I walk, or je me promenade. So these things are separate words, and the je is understood, the I is understood as something distinct. And it's easy for us to see that it's distinct because there are spaces around it, right? So there's a pause, it's a different word. But in Latin, this isn't the case, ambulando. It's one word, I walk. And the ending tells us what subject we're dealing with. And this is characteristic for a lot of especially ancient languages and languages that are not pidgins. I mean, we can go into this in more detail, but it's not helpful with respect to the origins of the language. So when you have a settled people who practice and speak a language for a long time, this is characteristic of it. Going back even further, oftentimes what we hear in anthropological circles is that language is such that you don't just have, a woman and then sitting. You will have a single word that encapsulates all of that, a woman sitting. And so it is the person and the action who are together as a single event. And so this arguably changes the way that you think about these things. And so with ancient Greek as well as it would have been with Latin, you're asking for a separation between things that are not normally linguistically separated. And so Socrates is asking for us to do more abstraction. He is pushing for us to go in the direction of abstracting things away, trying to get to the essence of things and figure out what stuff is, presumably. Some notion of truth or essence. What is the thing in its core, in its being, as an eternal idea, not just as a temporary, living and dying ephemeral thing. And that's the sense of the way that Plato's forms play into this, which we've already talked about. But, so for the Meno, he goes on, and he says, I don't understand the terms of the question. Let us be clear on the terms. And I think somebody in the modern day, like Wittgenstein, would smile, or would have smiled, and say that, yeah, sure, because he said that philosophical terms, that's the reason that we have a lot of confusion with things. We should be clear on our terms. And that was a big push by those in that circle, literally, anyway. During the 20th century and then in the 19th century as well, there was a big push to say we need to be clear about language, we need to be clear about our terms. If we could only be clear with our reason, then we would be able to solve a lot of these philosophical problems. And so this is like a heightened version of rationalism and a heightened version of Platonism to some extent. So this is the direction that Plato is pushing in. So what's interesting about this is that Meno continues and says, virtue is different for each individual person. It's different for a man, it's different for a woman, it's different for a child. And we might even push to say it's different not only in terms of what social role the person has, but also situationally what's going on. If I am playing the flute, then I have a different set of roles and expectations. I have a different set of virtues that are associated with flute playing that are not associated with me being a father or being a man or being a citizen or whatever. That is nuanced and interesting in a way that, Socrates wasn't looking for that. But arguably, there's something really interesting going on there, and this is what we'll hear later with Aristotle, and now, especially recently in philosophy, we hear a lot about situational ethics, because that's the way that people tend to really do things, is situationally. So we tell ourselves stories as though we're following these, axiomatic rules, as someone like Kant, would have liked. But in reality, that doesn't seem to be the way that we actually comport ourselves in the world. So that's kind of interesting. Anyway, that lies in the background here. So Socrates dismisses that. That's not what he's looking for. And he says, okay, well, maybe all the virtues have sophrosine and decay. In other words, maybe they are all species of moderation and justice. So now we're moving up the scale in terms of the forms. We're moving up the scale in terms of abstraction and considering the possibility that maybe moderation is one of the core concepts for the virtues. We're going to get that with Aristotle. Sophrosine is incredibly important for Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. But this isn't good enough. This isn't what Plato is looking for. He's not looking to tie it to another virtue. Moderation was another virtue. He's looking for the essence of all virtue. What is it that all of the virtues have in common? And that's something interesting, and that's something different. So Socrates compares his thinking here to the mystery religions. And this is particularly curious, I think, and this is something that Plato scholars, squirm sometimes when they hear this, depending upon how it is that they want to interpret Plato. If you're trying to interpret him as someone who is this ultimate philosophical systematizer, who has a bunch of rules and this network of concepts, and it all fits very tightly and neatly together, and thou shalt not tread on the way that the system is constructed, but Socratic irony, but the dialogue form, but the whole setup with what Plato's trying to do in proving the oracle wrong. There are a lot of reasons for us to think that, okay, there's a system there, but how important is that ultimately? What is he really trying to do in the end? What is he eventually trying to get to? And what we hear here, in particular, is that it's akin to the mystery religions. And there's a tie to the mystery religions. And Socrates seems to genuinely respect the mystery religions and religion in general for ancient Greece. It's just he wants to reform it and change it in certain ways. So that's kind of interesting, and he refers to, in other places, the ancient quarrel between mythos and logos. So presumably, the ancient quarrel between myth and reason, between reason and religion, well, not quite. It doesn't really work that way, but that's pushing in the direction of something that's very recognizable, arguably a little too recognizable for us to read that into what was going on in Plato, because it's clearly not the case that Socrates wants to get rid of religion and wants to get rid of things, especially like the experiential nature of the mystery religions. So this is something that is very much at odds. Mystery religions and practices are very much at odds with those who want to turn everything into a coldly logical system of, philosophical concepts and network of syllogisms, and that. It's just not the way that the mysteries work. And it's not the way that religion in general tends to work, unless it's engaging in a practice more exegetical and more like theology, which is an adjunct. It is not necessarily the absolute core, depending upon who you talk to, but in general, with religion, that's not the whole thing. So that's kind of interesting. Now, we proceed a little bit further, and Socrates is continuing to ask questions, and Meno is following him at each step of the way, and at a certain point he's stultified. He's stung and paralyzed and says, it's as if I talk about virtue all the time. I give the most excellent speeches on virtue, but I now don't know what to say. I don't know what the actual character of virtue is. Socrates, I'm lost. You've performed some kind of wizardry on me here, There's some sorcery. There's some, magic. In other words, kind of like sophistry. This is all sort of foreshadowing and allusions with respect to the way that sometimes people felt about this, as if Socrates was tricking them. And this is what we're going to get, for instance, in the jurors speaking in the Apology. So Socrates' defense, the trial for impiety. That's what they were thinking, was that he was a sophist and that he was just tricking people and was not doing good things for people and was not making them better because he was just tricking them, playing with words. And Meno gives us a hint of that, and later in the dialogue we hear from Anytus. Now, Anytus was actually one of the jurors, and he appears again in the Apology. And Anytus gets frustrated. It's very telling in the Meno. He gets frustrated and leaves. And Meno gives him a warning, which is a kind of dark foreshadowing and saying, you got to be careful. And indeed, unfortunately for Socrates, that, came home. That point was truly foreshadowing in how it is that Anytus would rule as part of that jury. So there's that. But the torpedo fish thing with Meno is very interesting. And so we picture like an electric eel or, something that paralyzes you. And Meno says that he feels as though he has been stung and paralyzed by Socrates and not knowing what to do. And this confusion is, it just seems awful because it's uncomfortable. But Socrates says, no, actually, this is perfect, as in, this is the appropriate step for this part of the dialectical progression. That's exactly what you want. You want this kind of thing to happen. You want that moment of confusion, because it is only in realizing that you don't know what you thought you knew that you can finally move on to try and investigate and learn something new, which is what the two do after that point in the dialogue. And so, to be able to have the space for learning something, you have to first clear away the illusion that you already know it. And so I think it's a very reasonable sort of approach, and it's one that we don't often think about in terms of trying to, undercut an argument and dismantle and show that it's not really working the way that you think it does before just putting forward a new argument on that topic, which is often the way, unfortunately, that we do things, and especially the way that we do things in political debates, but that's another story entirely. Okay, so this produces a situation where we have a description of what's called Meno's paradox, or the sophistic paradox. And that is, how can you know where to look for something if you don't know what it is? How can you know how to go about inquiring after something if you don't already know it? You can't even know the questions to ask the way this is told. You know, how can I know what questions to ask if I am not already an expert in that thing? And so it seems as though, based upon that sort of reasoning, that it would be impossible for us to learn anything. Or it just happens by accident, which is awful. And Socrates' answer to this is really telling. And this is one of the important parts of the dialogue, because this is where he describes the doctrine of anamnesis, which is the doctrine of recollection, through the example, the geometry example. This is called the geometry example with the slave boy. And so I think it's going to be really important for us to walk through that, although I don't expect it to be fully convincing in terms of actually, believing that anamnesis is the way to go and that's the way that knowledge works. The idea with anamnesis is that we don't learn anything. We're not actually learning anything truly new, where learning is understood specifically to apply to things that are new. In other words, a completely new concept that is unlike, it is not similar to anything else in our conceptual repertoire, anything else in our experience. It may be impossible for us to learn something like that. On the other hand, and I hear Hume in the background here, right, saying that all things are built upon experience in one shape or fashion. Anyway, that's another conversation for much later in philosophical history. So Socrates maintains this, and one of the reasons I think that people have trouble with it is not just the idea that we don't learn, but one of his justifications for it is that, oh, well, over innumerable lifetimes, over 10,000 lifetimes, then we surely have experienced all of these things before, and so we are remembering them in that way, in that kind of, way of metempsychosis and way of the transmigration of the soul between bodies. And this is just not the way that we typically think about these things now. And so that's unfortunate because the argument itself is not necessarily that problematic. And it harkens to something I think that's very interesting, especially in modern philosophy. And so I want to use Lévi-Strauss's term. So Claude Lévi-Strauss introduced the idea of bricolage. Bricolage is a handicraft. In other words, this is how he described traditional societies, polytheistic societies, which, by the way, were in ancient Greece, still polytheistic. Polytheistic societies assemble things from existing pieces. They take existing pieces and they recombine them in new ways and thereby introduce new ideas that are not really new. They're just pieced together. So I might take a box of Legos and I build something new out of it. I've never built it before, but I'm building it out of the existing pieces. In other words, I'm engaging in bricolage. I am a bricoleur in that way. It's just French terms for the handicraft and a craftsman. And so that's the sense, that's one possible sense that Socrates is referring to here in saying that we are assembling things from existing pieces. Now, what's missing is this notion of association and insight. And in other words, when we bring two things close to each other that are obviously similar, we naturally see the similarity. If I put two paintings right next to each other that are painted by completely different artists at different times and otherwise have nothing to do with each other, but they are conceptually and maybe compositionally very, very similar, you're immediately going to notice that. As a matter of fact, and this is the key to this part of the dialogue especially, you can't not notice it. You can't prevent yourself from noticing it. You're naturally going to notice the similarities. In other words, the act of association is not one that we necessarily have to try to do. It's something that just happens when we are put in the right situation. And so for Socrates, the teaching is all about putting people in the right situation to be able to take that next step forward. Okay, so let's take a look at the geometry example in a bit more detail. And this is one of those things where, having a picture is incredibly helpful. If you just follow the words of the dialogue, this can be really hard, but conceptually, I promise you, it's not that hard. If you know what the area of a square is, then you can do this. So let's consider a square. And so they take, have a stick in the sand or something and draw out a square. And so for our purposes, consider a square for each side, where each side is length 2. So the area of the square is 4. 2 times 2 is 4. And so, not a math class, right? So what does Socrates do? He says, okay, well, how do you draw a square that has twice the area of this square? And the slave boy, naturally, it's like, okay, well, how do we make something twice as big? You double it, right? Well, you can see the problem. What happens if you take a square where the sides are length 2 and you double the length of the sides? You end up with sides of length 4. 4 times 4 is not 8, it's 16. You're not only off, but you're way off. right? And so 2 didn't work, 4 didn't work. Okay, well, what about 3? So maybe it's, kind of in between. Well, 3 times 3 is 9. That's still not 8, so we don't get there. And then we have this point of, again, the torpedo fish moment, productive confusion, Dalmazine. So this is, I don't know what to do. I thought I understood this. I thought I could make a square that was twice the size, but obviously I can't. I must not really know how to do this. So now, okay, let's find out, help me to understand this. And this is where Socrates does something very clever, and if you see the square, it makes a whole lot more sense. So take the 2 by 2 square, and you'll see why it's 2 by 2 here in just a second. And you split it using a cross, horizontally and vertically, so that you end up with 4 1 by 1 squares. And so each of those squares is area 1, right? Now, it doesn't even matter that it's area 1. What matters is what we do next. So if I want to create a square that is half the area of my original square, I can take each of those little squares and divide it in half using a diagonal. So I'm not dividing it this way or this way, I'm using a diagonal. And you move that around, and as you move it around, you have a square inside of a square. So if you take the midpoints of each of the sides of the original square and you connect them all together, it still forms a square. And it just so happens that that bisects, it cuts in half each of those little squares, which means you're going to have a square in the end that is exactly half the size of the original. And so that's instructive, I think. Now, what Socrates doesn't say in this moment is what the actual sides are going to be. What is the measurement actually going to be? If we take our 2 by 2 square, and then I'm looking at the size of the square on the inside, the sides there contain an irrational number. The Greeks were not so good with irrational numbers, and Pythagoras famously had some particularly negative things to say about irrational numbers, at least purportedly, apocryphally. And so anyway, he doesn't go there, but he does say, okay, Meno, now you see he remembered all of this. I didn't teach him anything, I was just asking him questions, and he came up with this on his own. I asked him the question, what happens if we bisect this here? It's going to be half the area, right? Yeah, sure, okay, it's obviously half the area. That's not something where I'm having to learn a new concept, it's something that I would have already known. Yeah, of course I can take a square and split it into 2 triangles. I mean, that's kind of obviously right. So he's not getting anything new there, but when you put all of these existing pieces together, it creates an association and an insight such that now he sees, okay, I get it. Now I see how I can do this in a way that previously I, would not have thought that I understood. And so that's what's going on there. Now, of course, this is one of the many places that happens in the Socratic dialogues where the readers, especially us as modern readers, so we are inclined oftentimes to say, wait a minute, Meno is a little too quick to agree that this was recollection. Was it really recollection? Is it totally compelling that nothing new was happening whatsoever? Are we to say that that new association and insight does not count as knowledge and does not count as anything new? That's interesting in a way that I'm not sure that most people now would agree with, but it's important for a variety of ways in Plato's philosophy. So anyway, that's what happens there. Now, what's funny is that it's at this point in the dialogue where Socrates does something extremely frustrating for interpreters of Plato. And he says that he's not entirely confident of everything that he's said. In other words, take some of this with a grain of salt. Don't take it and try to distill syllogisms from it. Don't take it and try to make this into a logical thing, because that's not ultimately what's going on. And we get hints of this elsewhere. In the 7th letter, he talks about, the association's insight as a kind of fire that feeds on itself from an initial spark, and that's the way that we grow and learn and become wiser. That's the sort of thing that, and it matters that it's wisdom, right, rather than knowledge, because Socrates is going to say that he doesn't know, but that he has a wisdom, not a superhuman wisdom. All of these things fit together. There are reasons for them, but oftentimes you have to go to the different dialogues to see what's going on. In the Timaeus as well, Socrates is famous for saying that, we're not looking for truth necessarily, we're looking for something that looks like truth. It has truth-likeness. So it has eikos mutos, so it is a likely story about truth. In other words, I can't tell you what the truth is directly, so I'm going to tell you a story that is similar to it, that smacks of truth. And all of this, it points to experience, like this, neon signs at all times, pointing to having the experience yourself, having the insight yourself, and understanding things and growing that way. So anyway, that's part of what's going on here, and for those who want to interpret Plato completely logically, you're going to be frustrated. So, all right, so another thing I should say as well with respect to reincarnation and metempsychosis and the way that the Greeks thought of this, and another possibility for us thinking about these ideas and his justification for it. So one of the other possibilities I think that's opening for us, maybe not completely open, but opening as a process of history right now, is the idea of what Jung called, Carl Jung, a century ago, a common psychic substrate. And so it may be, and this points in the direction of a kind of hive mind sort of thing. In other words, it points in the direction of a common psychic background, for a common psychological background, a common mental makeup for all people. Now, I said hive mind. The Jungians in the crowd may not like that as much. It's not, well, that's not really what he was doing. Well, okay, but that gives us an entry point into thinking about it. And now we're talking about more of this kind of thing, and especially by virtue of what happened with the extended mind and now rolling into, brain-computer interfaces, brain-brain interfaces, and this smearing of individuality that's very slowly happening over time, where we are coming to grips with, the idea that myself is not necessarily the same from one moment to the next, changes over my lifetime and bleeds into other environments, other objects, and maybe even other people around me. Think something like Heidegger's modes of being. So anyway, there is that. So that's another possibility that we might entertain here. Now, okay, they return to the question of, okay, well, does this mean virtue can't have teachers? What are we to say about virtue and the possibility of teaching it? If it was possible to teach it, then those who are most highly motivated and have the resources to do so, surely they would want to do so. So if you're highly placed politically with a lot of money, then you're going to want your sons to become very virtuous so that they can succeed you as senators or as emperor or whatever it might happen to be. And Socrates provides an example here and says, look, if this was possible, then surely Themistocles would have done it. But obviously, it's not really, that doesn't work. He wasn't able to succeed. We know that his son wasn't a particularly virtuous person. And I don't think this is hard for us to see, that this is the opposite of the sort of apple doesn't fall far from the tree kind of phenomenon, in the sense that all kids are different. And so it's not something necessarily, by that argument, that we would be able to teach, at least not with any certainty. And so that's part of what goes on here, and that creates a special problem. In other words, are we high enough up with the forms that we can't even teach virtue? Is there anything about virtue that is able to be taught? And so that's part of what they're trying to investigate and part of what they're trying to get to here in this dialogue, but of course it doesn't end with any kind of finality. It ends instead, unfortunately, as I mentioned with the nidus, stomping off and getting frustrated with it, not being able to tell the difference between Socrates and sophistry. Now, the way that this ends, which is kind of interesting, he asks, is knowledge the same as doxa orthe? So in other words, is it the same as right opinion? And, this is the differentiation between with the forms, the realm of opinion, which is the realm of individual things and manifestations, instantiation of the forms, and the Empyrean realm of the forms, the eternal. And so is virtue the same as that? Well, it almost can't be. If virtue is in the realm of the forms, then it's not just right opinion. There's also, something else going on there. And indeed, this is what Socrates refers to, and again points to a quasi-religious sort of idea in saying that it's more like people who are blessed, people who are divine. And we say that people who are virtuous are divine in a certain way. And I like the translation of blessed here because it provides a number of things that I think are productive in terms of the discussion. It provides a kind of quiet, comprehensive happiness, fulfillment, and living well, but also one that is distinctly and recognizably religious in character. And so that begs the question of what other role, might we have here for things beside reason. So in other words, besides what is traditionally considered, syllogistic logic and philosophy and reason and exercise of reason and dialectic, and maybe there's something slightly different going on beyond that.